Okay.
All right.
I guess that means it's time for X marks the spot, doesn't it?
X gonna give it to you.
X gonna give it to you. In this case, I'm gonna give it to you. In the montage, you heard Johnny Hit and Run Pauline, and now you're going to hear Los Angeles. All right, Matt, why don't you run the numbers for us?
Okay, so X's Los Angeles from 1980 comes in at number 151 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 22 in 1980, number 1004 of all time. It's X's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, and it is the one record on this week that did make Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 320.
Okay, so I think that might be the first time, Matt, I remembered to throw to you the numbers.
Yes.
In the
It was
entire
pretty,
history of
yeah.
the podcast.
It's been a while, John, but good job.
So I'm pretty impressed with myself. All right, so X, I'm going to highly credit all music because while I did some scavenging around for bio, I felt that all music did a great job of synthesizing the information I got and putting it in sort of a chronological order. And I think it's well known that as the bio guy, I'm probably the most sparse in terms of how much I provide, but this is an interesting band, so I'll try to give a little bit more than the average. Much like the Pretenders, who we did last week, we have to start with an individual in the band. In the Pretenders, it was Chrissie Hynde. In X, it would be the bassist, vocalist, and songwriter John Doe. His real name is John Nommensen Duchak, or Duchak. I was not able to find a pronunciation one way or the other, so I apologize. But he is pretty much universally known as John Doe, which I think is a great punk rock name. And he was born in Baltimore and moved to L.A. in 1976. And X is an L.A. band, and it's important to know that because X is kind of considered the first and maybe the most critically acclaimed LA band. We'll talk a little bit about their legacy, punk LA band, I should say. We'll talk a little bit about their legacy later and the bands that followed in their aftermath and who were influenced by them. But that's one thing to know. They're an LA band. So Doe had loved Patti Smith's Horses, just like Josh and I, and unlike Matt, who, as we all know, was wrong. But John Doe had the same
Except
reaction
we wasn't.
that all of us who have good taste in music had, and he said, boy, this album is awesome. I'd like to form my own band. And he went out to LA to do that. In my favorite CTS origin story mode, he placed an ad in a newspaper. I probably like music, like Melody Maker or something a little bit better than that, but newspaper ad works as well. So John Doe meets the man who was born Ty Kindle, but goes by the name Billy Zoom in X. And he is a guitarist. He was originally from Savannah, Illinois. And this is important with the sonic palette that becomes X. You've got John Doe, who loved punk rock, and Billy Zoom was a guitarist who had played rockabilly, blues, and R&B as a session guitarist, which is becoming. In fact, he even backed Gene Vincent at one part, which I thought was really interesting because it doesn't get much more rockabilly than that. So the other good piece of news for Mr. Doe was that Zoom had also recently discovered the Ramones, and he decided that he wanted to start playing music that was faster, louder as well with his rockabilly stuff. So when you hear that, you get a little bit, for sure, of the sonic palette. So you've got Doe, you've got Zoom, and they create a band. They've got a couple different drummers who are coming in. There was a guy named Mick Basher at one point. There's some session drummers. And then finally, they decide to grab a drummer by the name of DJ Bonebreak, which I thought was an awesome name. And they had seen him performing at LA's punk club called The Mosque, Masque. And he was in a band called The Eyes, and John Doe saw him, picked him up, and he ends up joining X in February 1978. The last piece of the puzzle is the vocalist, born Christine Cervenkova, but she goes by Exene Cervenka. That is the final member of the group. She was a poet. She, in fact, was in a poetry workshop with John Doe, and they begin dating. And basically, he reads one of her pieces, thinks it may be a good song, asks permission to sing it in the band. Cervenka eventually says, I think I'd rather sing it myself. And then eventually she ends up kind of coming into the band. Now, she does not have the musical experience that the rest of them did. Doe had been in bar bands, and as we mentioned before, Billy Zoom was a guy who played rockabilly, blues, and R&B. The drummer was a set guy. Exene Cervenka came in with absolutely no experience, so there is a punk element there of DIY. So they come together in mid-1978, and they're playing the LA punk scene, which goes from one club to about 3 clubs. They release a single called Adult Books Between We're Desperate is the name of the single, which is, and the between, by the way, is B/W. So it's a very interesting first single name. They release it on a very well-known West Coast punk label. I don't know how much you guys know your punk history. I know quite a bit. It's called Danger House Records, and the single sells well in that scene. And X then does a second single, which becomes Los Angeles, which is the Los Angeles that is on this album. They get on a compilation, and basically they're about ready to break, and then the band becomes unhappy with Danger House, and they opt instead, basically, for this and their next album, they pretty much do it themselves and sign with an album called Slash Records, but they're kind of doing a lot of their own work. Slash Records is very small and very indie. They would not sign with a full-on major label until their third album. So this album, their first, was actually released on Slash Records, the indie record label. So this is an indie record, guys, in terms of the origin story. Another interesting thing I thought was, and this is key to this album, X gets a pretty well-known fan. Ray Manzarek from The Doors was very impressed by their sound and the songs himself, and even watched them play Soul Kitchen, which is also on this album, which is a Doors song and sounds like a Doors song. On this album. Yep,
is that him on the organ?
And he is on the organ. on that.
Okay, makes sense.
So Manzarek ends up playing the keys at a bunch of gigs for X, and then says he will produce their first album, and does. They recorded the album for $10,000 in April of 1980, and pretty much it's an immediate success in terms of in the scene. It's a high success for a punk band in a large city, which in 1980 for a punk band was a really big fucking deal, right? Like, now we can look at it in terms of the general, sales, right? But it sold 50,000 copies, which was considered to be a pretty remarkable sum for both a punk album and especially for like an independent punk album, right? That was not really getting any sort of press behind it. It just was existing on word of mouth. They tour all the time in the aftermath, and then they are a part of this is one for Josh's movie corner. It's a great movie, Josh. The Decline of Western Civilization.
Oh, yeah. I've seen all three.
I was about to say, you saw? Okay, gotcha. That one of them's about the LA punk community, and X is all over that one. It's a great movie. I've seen it many times. And also, that is the year where Exene Cervenka and John Doe get married. And that's kind of chronicled in The Decline of Western Civilization as well. So that is sort of the origin story leading up to this album. Now, in terms of the album itself, there's a couple things that are interesting about it. Josh mentioned one already, that Ray Manzarek plays the keys on it. And the other thing I think was that the lyrics originally were written as straight, like poetry. And then they were sort of fine-tuned to become more palatable musically, which I thought was very interesting and actually very noticeable when you're paying attention to the lyrics. I wish I could say that there was like a huge, interesting, story after Los Angeles, but they kind of have like the classic, 80s punk rock, even like post-punk type of deal. They They release another album that does relatively well. They sign with Elektra in 1982. They try to reinvent their sound at the request of multiple members of the band who kind of want to go for it in terms of, breaking into the mainstream. Unfortunately, it's the worst of both worlds because it loses them their punk audience and doesn't really lead to a major breakthrough. I think their biggest hit peaked at 26 on the Billboard Rock chart in 1985. The song is called Burning House of Love, and it doesn't sound anything like this album. They periodically reinvent and come back. They came back for one reunion in 1990. I should mention they break up in 1987, and it's kind of funny because they show up after 1987 in the oddest places. The X has the cover of Wild Thing that you might know as the Wild Thing that's used in Major League, not the original one. You know the one, and now I think might be known for those that are wrestling fans. It's what Jon Moxley uses in AEW, but that version of Wild Thing is an X song, believe it or not. So in case you want a little bit of background there. They do one reunion from 1993 to 95, and then they stop, and then they do another reunion from it's 1998. They do a farewell tour, and Manzarek comes back and plays with them. They say it's going to be their final tour, but of course it isn't because they reunite again in 2008, and they've been touring sort of sporadically ever since then. So kind of an interesting journey. They still are playing presently, and the members of the band that are still in it are the originals. So
wow,
all four of them are there. Yep. So there we go. There's X Los Angeles.
And no more albums, John, or they're just touring. They're not really doing albums, or are they?
You mean in 2008 era or after this album?
Like after now, like they're still around, or they're not, but they haven't really.
So I'm taking a peek right now to see their discography real quick. They were prolific between 1980 and 1987. They have 6 albums during that time. They released an album in 1993 called Hey Zeus, and then they do not release another album again until 2020 when they release an album called Alphabet Land. And it says here it was released digitally in April 2020, their first studio release in 27 years.
Wow.
And the first with their original lineup in 35 years. And apparently it just dropped.
Yeah, right.
And it was designed to coincide with the 40th anniversary of this album, Los Angeles, and it received positive reviews from critics, but it kind of just dropped on the anniversary of it. So there you go, Matt, if you want to know a little bit. While you're there, Matt, why don't you tell me what you thought about this album?
So this is my take on this album is that I am totally in the middle on it. I like it. I don't love it. I don't hate it. It's just I listened to it several times, and I never got to the point where I was like, oh, I really, really like this song. I think probably my favorite song on here is Nausea. That to me seemed like to be a little bit more interesting. It wasn't as straightforward. There's a lot of songs on here that are just like straightforward, kind of like faster paced rock songs or punk songs, and I like them fine. Nausea seemed to be it's slowed down. It's got the chorus it's a little darker. It's a little bit. It just seemed a little bit more interesting to me. There's parts of Los Angeles that I like. The beat there. But I listened to this album several times, and I always walked away going, yeah, it was good. It was fine. So I don't. It's certainly not reinventing anything. It's just kind of a continuation of punk, mostly punk music. And
I will disagree with you on that during my time, just as an FYI.
Well, you'll have your time. So I liked the double vocals. I thought that was kind of cool. The male and female vocal. I did like that aspect of it. So that was kind of unique to it. So yeah, I'm kind of in the middle on it, and I was really trying to listen to it and trying to be like, okay, maybe this time I'll have more of a strong take, and I really just don't have a strong take on this record, and I don't have better way to say it than that. It probably did the least for me of all three of these. I can't really say that it did much for me that I would go back to it, but that's not saying that like if somebody put it on and be like, oh, this is terrible, or I don't like this at all, it's fine. It's like, okay, put it on, it's great. But it's also not great in the sense that like it just didn't take me to any other place other than just being like generally like kind of just there for me, really. I don't know what else to say. And it's weird because there's definitely, I hear it and I go, well, this is upbeat and it's energetic, and I could maybe if I saw it at a show or saw it live or something like that, I would get more into it. But just a little flat on it, but overall, thumbs in the middle, I would say.
Well, you've missed the lyrics component to to the album.
There you go. See?
I totally get the influence of Patti Smith on this band now after hearing that.
Do we feel like Matt needs to at least have the lyrics up sometimes? Like, is it like getting to the point where like
it's not gonna do much?
Borderline negligence though? Like to not, it would be like me just saying, I listened to this album, but without the drums. I just listen. I wonder if
yeah,
have to force
it's even if I did, it's God, man, the music's got to be there. I'm telling you.
Well, I love Patti Smith, and I really like this album. Not sure I love it, but it is like a good marriage of really strong. It is very much poetic lyrics in style when you read them, married with this nice rockabilly punk, Chuck Berry-esque rock and roll sound, and I really like the combination of those. I also like the dual vocals. Matt said I feel like that offers a really good dynamic. They kind of play off of each other, and they're both strong or comparable to each other. And I like the stripped down sound of this. I feel like the energy carries through. It is very dark in content, especially with like Johnny Hit and Run Pauline and Nausea and Sex and Dying in High Society, which is kind of satire, I would say, or just a dark comedy in a song format. And I just kind of really love the aesthetic of this. I get what you're saying, that it's not really complex, but I can see the Ramones influence. I can see all of those things that the guitarist took and tried to add to it. And I feel like this is kind of a seminal album as a result. I can totally see the influence other bands probably had from it. And I just really kind of appreciate its vibe and its energy. It's I've seen John Doe in interviews, I think, or on somewhere along the way, in talk shows or documentaries, music docs or something, and he always seems very well spoken and thoughtful in his comments, and I feel like this is another album that's kind of one of those necessary to kind of understand the progression of punk music, and especially with the LA, like probably hardcore plays into this to some extent, or is influenced by this.
Well, the rest of the LA scene is a lot more in that heart. Yeah, I mean, Black Flag, of course, is the one that comes to mind, but like the Germs and other bands like that, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's just it's well worth listening to, and the organ. I forgot to mention the organ. I really like the appearance of the organ. It's not on every song, but when it's added, it really kind of ups the
that's true.
Song ability.
That does give it a more of a distinct sound. You're right. I didn't mention that, but you're absolutely right about that.
And I can kind of see why Ray Manzarek would like this band too. The lyrics are reminiscent of Morrison in a lot of ways, and kind of what the Doors were trying to do. And this is kind of like Doors-esque, Doors adjacent, but in a punk mode. And that rockabilly sound just kind of carries me through as well. So yeah, this was an enjoyable listen.
Yeah, that Soul Kitchen sounds nothing like the Doors song, though.
No.
I
didn't even at least know it was the Doors song until later, upon listening. But what about you, John?
Yeah, I love this album, man. This is one of the five, in my opinion, this is one of the five best punk albums ever made. It's incredibly tight. It's all of the things that make an album gleamy, that punk sometimes does. There's a rawness to it, but there's also a studio proficiency to it, which, boy, it is difficult to pull off polished punk that doesn't sound like... And there was a lot of polished punk in the 90s that kind of just sounded ballless and shitty, and like there's a lot of bad pop punk, as much as I like Green Day, and I think they're the one that pulled it off, right? There's a lot, and let's be honest, like a lot of like 90s punk is for people that don't really like real punk, right? It's kind of like, I'd like punk if it was not quite as offensive and didn't sound so raw, and then it's like, then there's that line of like, is this punk? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and
it's a little watered down.
Still, well, and this is still in the spirit of punk. There's a stripped down nature of it. All punk to some degree, to me, always comes from that 50s sort of surf rock, Chuck Berry combination sound, right? And your rockabilly can easily go in there as well. And that's all over this album. And I love that because, the Ramones have that too. The Ramones sound like, a 50s rock band just taken into the punk world, right? And a lot of punk has that. We talked about Blondie, right? And similar type stuff. And there's a lot of that. Really hardcore is sort of where they reject that a little bit, and kind of move into a different vibe. But this is still firmly in the type of punk that was being done in Great Britain, right? What they're going for. It's a incredibly good album lyrically, as Josh mentioned. Johnny Hit and Run Pauline is about date rape, and it's a legitimately moving song. It's I don't think it's an autobiographical song, but it could easily be one because of the story told. I think Sublime kind of later puts a spin on it, right, with date rape themselves, but it's a very similar type of theme, right, like a first-person account of what's going on. The title track, Los Angeles, is a fantastic freaking song. Like, it's a great punk rock song that has crossover appeal to it. As in terms of like relationship songs, Your Phone's Off the Hook But You're Not is both hilarious and profound. And Nausea is just a freaking fantastic song. It's incredible live, having seen it played live, and just there's an energy to it. And this album just sparkles with energy and creativity. I think both you guys, you mentioned the harmonies, but I think it's important to note that like Exene Cervenka, she has kind of like a non-traditional voice that kind of at times there's an urgency to it, and there's a very amateurish feel to it that has the punk spirit, and it's like it's a high voice at times, but it also can go a little bit into a lower cadence, whereas John Doe's voice is a much lower cadence. So they play off each other very well. It's kind of like, while they don't sound like this band, it's kind of like Alice in Chains with Lane Staley and Jerry Cantrell's different timbres, and how they come together. And they do a lot of almost dialogue type of vocals on the tracks. But yeah, I mean, this one gets a high recommend. I'm actually shocked you guys don't like this album more, because to me, this is kind, and like Josh said, you can't understand punk that's going to come without listening to this album, because this is the next evolution. This is American punk rock that's outside of New York, right? This is what punk rock sounded like outside of New York. And to understand American punk, you have to understand both New York, the Bay Area, and LA. And this band does have some similar elements to the Dead Kennedys lyrically and sort of in their ethos, even if the Dead Kennedys were sort of not really all that interested in sounding pretty or tight, whereas this band sounds tight and pretties it up. And it's kind of remarkable, actually. You wonder if they rolled around like the early 90s, if X would have had a completely different career, when punk was allowed to be, in a different realm. And I can't you see kind of X in like a world of indie rock and where punk was at in the 90s? X just kind of fits in.
I see that a little bit. Yep.
They're ahead of their time in that sense too. Yep. Strong recommendation for me on this album. This is a great album.
Yeah, I'm maybe not as effusive as you, but I still really liked it. I think I would probably want to listen to it more ultimately as well. I kind of know them by reputation more than their sound.
I don't know though if like this is an album that like I feel like you either get this or you don't. You know what I mean? It's just I look at this as like a punk litmus test. Like kind of if you don't like this, there's going to be limits to how much punk you're going to like, right? Because this is to me a very aesthetically pleasing sound, and I'm pretty sure that anybody from people that listen to hardcore to more middle of the road punk, it's going to be right up their alley. So I kind of do feel like if you don't love this album, punk may not be for you to some degree, which is okay. You're allowed to not like something, but I do feel
it's
like
never been. I mean, certainly hardcore is not my thing, and punk I've always liked elements of it, but I would not say it's my favorite. It's my favorite genre, or one of my favorite genres. So I mean, I really was like just thinking about what am I going to say about this record? How can I pick apart? And it's weird. I was just struggling for anything like really, I don't know, unique or significant to say about it other than I liked it, but it was like it just kind of was. It was also there, so it's also kind of like, that sounds like I didn't like it, but it just it's a quintessential thumbs in the middle album for me, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, this one's going to be high on my list of albums, not just from 1980, but in the 80s. I also think this album has, if you like this album, it's got max replayability. This is an album I can come back to. I first listened to it when I was like 13 maybe, and I come back to it every 3 or 4 years, and every time I come back to it, I like it just as much as I did before. And I think I could be, hopefully, if I make it to 90, right, I could still listen to this album, and I'm sure I'll still like that album in 90, because there's a timelessness to what X is singing about and sort of who they are that I think, unlike, say, Blizzard of Oz or Pat Benatar or some other stuff that we're listening to, even Pylon sounds of its time, right? This one, to me, transcends the era. Like, I could have easily told you this was in, like, 1991 or 2001, I feel like, and it would have been like, oh yeah, okay, this could have been recorded there.
Yeah. Yep.